Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. We'll just give it a few more minutes just to wait until everyone joins. I see that there are quite a few people that are starting to come into the Zoom meeting. Yeah, so first maybe to set the scene a little bit and just introduce myself. So my name is Jonathan Crook, and I work at Carbon Market Watch in our global carbon markets team, looking at the supply and demand for carbon credits, how they're used by companies, and the overall kind of quality of credits overall. And I'll be moderating and opening the session today. Like I mentioned, for the sake of time, I think we will get started for those who've been able to join as we've started. We've had over 200 registrations, so I expect there will be quite a few in the audience who will be rolling in as the session continues. But yeah, let's get started. So I think first of all, a bit of housekeeping rules for today. So there is a Q&A function, which you can see for attendees. So if you have questions that come up during the session, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. And then the speakers that we have today will try to respond to the extent it's possible during the session. But of course, we also have some time reserved at the end for a Q&A session. So yeah, please feel free to post your questions directly in the Q&A. The webinar is also being recorded, so it will be available afterwards in case you'd like to share it further for maybe colleagues who weren't able to attend our session today. So yeah, the recording will be made available afterwards. And so yeah, I think with that, with some of the practical details now out of the way, let's go ahead and move with kind of the content of today's webinar. So the focus today of our webinar, as you no doubt know since you signed up for it, is about carbon credits and specifically what impact, if any, their purchase by companies has on accelerating corporate decarbonization. And to set the scene a little bit for our discussion, over the last few years, there's been a lot of competing narratives on carbon credits and what role they do or what role they should play in corporate climate strategies. And among those narratives, one that's been pushed quite strongly, especially by actors with financial interest in carbon credits, but also by companies, integrity initiatives, and governments. And that narrative has been that the use of credits by companies actually drives greater climate ambition in those same companies. And some go really far with this narrative and claim that there's an actual causal link between the purchase of credits and greater corporate ambition. While others are more prudent and say there's a correlation. So, of course, there's a big difference between correlation and causation, and I won't get into that now, but that's also a nuance that's often been lost in this debate. So to help us clarify the debate and unpack a lot of these questions, I'm very excited to hear from our excellent speakers today, who I'm pleased to introduce. So first, Niklas Stolz, who is a PhD candidate at ETH Zurich, who co-authored a peer-reviewed research paper with Benedikt Probst that was published in Nature Communications in September of this year, that's entitled The Negligible Role of Carbon Offsetting in Corporate Climate Strategies, which dives straight into the theme of our webinar today. Next, we have Sophia Lauer, who is researcher at OCO Institute, who among other things was the lead author for reports that CMW, so Carbon Market Watch, commissioned on the topic of today's webinar, which was published just 2 days ago and is entitled Correlation or Causation, Challenges in Assessing the Effect of Carbon Credit Use on Corporate Climate Action. And we also have Benja Faecks, policy expert at Carbon Market Watch, who led our policy briefing that builds on OCO Institute's research and who in Carbon Market Watch has a specific focus on the use of carbon credits by companies and the wider landscape of corporate climate standards. So welcome to our speakers. Thank you for being here. And with that, let's get things going. So first on our speak is Niklas. Niklas, it'd be great to hear more about the findings from your research, which I briefly introduced, and over to you. I think you are muted still for now.
Yes, thank you very much. You can hear me now, right?
Yep.
Okay, go for it. Thanks. So yeah, as already introduced, I will tell you a bit more about our article that we published early this year together with Dr. Benedict Probst on the negligible role of carbon credits in corporate climate strategies. And to kind of set the stage why we did this, or how we came to writing this article, was the origin was in early 2023, where the situation in carbon markets was pretty bad. So they were both peer-reviewed research articles and also investigative journalism that criticized carbon markets because they found that many of the carbon credits that were sold in these markets did not entail real emission reductions. That was very big in the media, and even as you see on the bottom left, some of these articles criticized companies that bought these carbon credits and were not necessarily even involved in developing these carbon credits. So as a consequence of this, there was a pretty sharp decline in trading volume of carbon credits, which is obviously bad for industry that depends on the sales of these credits. But then shortly afterwards, there were finally some positive messages. So there were three industry reports by three different entities that actually found that the companies that buy carbon credits also decarbonize faster. And there was a message which was very, let's say, enthusiastically taken up by the space. So companies and newsletters from this space reported on it, and basically the overarching message was you should not criticize these companies for buying carbon credits, because not only do they fund climate action through these carbon credit purchases, but they also the companies that decarbonize faster than other companies. So they're the wrong address for criticism. But when we read these industry reports, we were a bit skeptical. And one of the main points of our skepticism was that although these reports use a large number of companies that they compare, all of them use more than 4,000 companies, they don't really distinguish between other factors that control how a company operates, except for carbon credits. And to illustrate what I mean, here's the short example. So the numbers are just to make this point. They don't reflect any real organization. But if you compared a multinational car manufacturer, which is publicly listed, it's therefore also under the EU's non-financial reporting directive and under other regulation that has many employees, high revenue, uses carbon credits and changes scope 1 emission by 5%, with another regional car part supplier that is not publicly listed, is not under the non-financial reporting directive, has fewer employees, only $180 million a year, and they don't use carbon credits and change scope 1 emissions by 3% in the study timeframe. If you only compared the use of carbon credits and emission reduction, then you would come to the conclusion that carbon credits leads, in fact, to higher emission reductions. But this ignores all these other factors, which very likely have way higher impact on the company's decision-making. So therefore, we set out to answer two questions. Number one is, do emission offsetting companies actually show better environmental performance than their peers? And then secondly, how do companies actually use these voluntary carbon credits in their climate strategies? In our sample that we used for answering these questions are 89 multinational companies in the oil and gas, automobile, and airline sector. So these are very similar companies because they have a global reach, are generally big, and are in sectors that are key to decarbonize if we want to get close to net zero. We used the same data source as the industry reports did for quantitative data, the CDP database, and added some qualitative data from sustainability and annual reports of companies. And therefore, we ended up with a coverage of around 1/4 of all credits that were retired in 2022 in our study. And as indicators for environmental performance of companies, we use two indicators. Number one, the change in scope 1 emissions between 2017 and 2022 as a forward-looking indicator, as a backward-looking indicator, and then the climate target ambition of companies, so where companies aim to be with their emissions in the future, as a forward-looking indicator. Additionally, we controlled for companies' annual revenue, the sector they're based in, and the content of their headquarters. All right, so then let's dive into the results here. here you can see the regression results of these two indicators on different explanatory variables. How do you reread this graph? So here you can see the change in scope 1 emissions. And whenever one of these blue lines is not on the zero line, we see a significant effect. We see, however, that the number of carbon credits a company retires is more or less exactly on the zero line. So we cannot say that we do not find that the effect of this variable is significantly different from zero. The same is for climate target ambition. The number of retired credits is also lies more or less exactly on the zero line. So we find that carbon credits are not associated or not significantly associated with faster decarbonization or higher climate target ambition, in contrast to the industry reports that I mentioned before. All right, so question number one, somewhat we find no significantly difference between companies that use offsets and those that don't. So now, how do companies actually use these carbon credits in their strategies? And first, we looked at how much money relative to their capital expenditures do companies actually spend on carbon credits. So here on the x-axis, you see the share relative to companies' capital expenditures that they spend on carbon credits. And on the y-axis, you see the 15 companies with the highest share of share they spend relative to their capex on carbon credits. And again, we see for most companies, so all companies from here upwards spend very little on carbon credits. So all of them spend consistently less than 0.5% relative to their capital expenditures on carbon credits. So in turn, even if they would spend this money on internal decarbonization, it would probably not make a massive difference. However, there are two outliers, Delta Airlines and EasyJet. They spent 1.8 or 2.7% of their capital expenditure on carbon credits, which is quite a lot more than all the other companies. A similar picture we see when we look at the share of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions that company offsets over the study time. Again, we see two outliers with EasyJet and Delta Airlines, which spent quite a significant or substantial share of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions on carbon credits, while most other companies spend a very small share. So the oil and gas company with the highest share of offset scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions is Eni with 1.4%. And for our automotive companies, it's Volkswagen with 1.1%. But again, there are these outliers of EasyJet and Delta Airlines. And since it seems like these companies are special in regard how they use carbon credits in their strategies, we decided to zoom a bit more into these cases to have some qualitative evidence on how they use carbon credits. And what was interesting when we looked at Delta Airlines, in 2020, they announced that they would invest $1 billion toward their climate neutrality over the next 10 years. So in turn, around $100 million per year on climate neutrality. And this includes emission reductions within Delta, scaling up of sustainable aviation fuel, expanding their offset portfolio, and advancing new technologies. And actually, in the end of 2022, so after 3 years, when they should have spent $300 million, they spent $284 million of those 300 on emission offsetting. So basically, offsetting ate up almost the entire decarbonization budget, and that was despite COVID making Delta fly less and also therefore having lower emissions. It shows that if companies make emission offsetting a key pillar of their decarbonization strategy and share a budget between carbon credits and internal decarbonization or climate innovation, then there's a direct competition between these two, which might lead to adverse outcomes where less money is spent on internal decarbonization. Now, one also has to say in this case that after 2022, Delta Airlines decided to stop their large-scale offsetting campaign. And also later they acknowledged that they would need more than $1 billion for their climate neutrality path. So we can see that also these strategies are not static but dynamic over time. So to sum up, we find that voluntary emission offsetting is not associated with improved climate performance, contrary to what industry report found. Companies generally spend very little money on emission offsetting and offset small shares of their total emissions. And in extreme cases, especially if companies have a shared budget between carbon credit spendings and internal decarbonization, these can compete among each other and leads to delayed internal decarbonization, although for this we only find qualitative and not quantitative evidence. So thank you very much. Here you can find the link to the publication.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. Thanks for that great presentation. And yeah, I remember seeing when your study came out with great interest, because indeed it's injected a lot more nuance into this debate than we'd been seeing over the last year. So it's really great to have this summary of those findings. And of course, the full study is also out there if people want to dive into more of the details. So yeah, now next I'd like to give the floor to Sophia Lauer from OCO Institute. As I mentioned before, OCO has just published a report 2 days ago on this topic entitled Correlation or Causation, Challenges in Assessing the Effect of Carbon Credits Use on Corporate Climate Action. Yeah, and I'll let Sophia take it away and give us more insight into her findings.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, then thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present our study here today. As you said, it's called Correlation or Causation, Challenges in Assessing the Effect of Carbon Credit Use on Corporate Climate Action. The study has been commissioned by Carbon Market Watch and published on Tuesday, and you can also find it both on the website of Carbon Market Watch and OCO Institute if you want to read the details. And today I want to briefly present to you the aim of our study, our approach, and then also our key findings. So the aim of our study was to contribute to the question of whether carbon credits have a causal effect on companies' internal emission reductions. And to do so, we proceeded in 3 steps. In the first step, we conducted a literature review on the potential determinants of carbon credit use and also the relationship between the use of carbon credits and emission reductions. And based on that, we identified which conclusions can be drawn from existing studies and also which research gaps still remain. Then in the second step, we conducted interviews with a few companies to get a better understanding of the role of carbon credits in companies' climate strategies. And then in the last step, we investigated the challenges and also the prospect of developing a study design that would be suitable to actually assess the question of whether carbon credits have a causal effect on emission reductions. I want to start with highlighting the key takeaways from the literature review. Some of this may overlap with what Nicholas already said, but I just want to keep it very short and brief. So essentially, we found that there are theoretical mechanisms through which carbon credits could enhance or reduce emission reductions or have no effect at all, depending on how companies use them and what the company's climate strategies are. Then empirically, there are several studies finding the positive correlation between carbon credit use and internal emission reductions. Basically, those were the studies that compared the groups of users of carbon credits, so companies that use carbon credits against companies that don't use carbon credits, and they find that companies that use carbon credits decarbonize more than the others. And this finding could, however, as Nicholas just presented to us, not be confirmed in the peer-reviewed study by Nicholas Stolz and Dr. Ben Probst. They find no significant correlation as they account for revenue and sector and so on. And for these few companies, they also found that carbon credits competed with internal emission reductions. So this is a bit of a recap also of what Niklas said. And what I want to highlight here is that these studies look at correlation, but they don't look at causality. And that is an important distinction because correlation cannot answer the question of what actually drives internal emission reductions and if that is linked to carbon credits. So the correlation cannot prove a causal effect, or it can also not necessarily rule out a causal effect. And therefore, we derive that overall no definite conclusion can be drawn as to whether carbon credits have a causal effect on internal emission reductions or not, and if so, whether that effect would be positive or negative. Then I want to share the insights or the key insights that we derived from the interviews with companies. So first of all, I want to highlight we interviewed a small number of companies, 6 in total, and some of the companies were intermediaries on the voluntary carbon market, and some of the companies were like direct buyers of carbon credits. And what we found very interesting or what we derived from the interviews that is very interesting is that carbon credits are used for several use purposes. So for instance, to make offsetting claims, to reach climate targets, to signal corporate social responsibility, just to name a few. And we also derived that how carbon credits can affect internal emission reductions could be linked to the use case. So for instance, when carbon credits can be used to achieve climate targets, there could be a competition between carbon credits and emission reductions because both carbon credits and internal measures could be used in place of each other to achieve the same goal, especially if there's one common and fixed budget. And this is also aligned with Niklas' study. In contrast to that, if there is competition or the likelihood of a competition between carbon credits and internal emission reduction measures is less so when companies set ambitious climate targets that cannot be used with cannot be achieved through carbon credit use. Because in that case, carbon credits cannot be used for the same purpose as internal emission reductions, but they can only be used to go beyond that, go beyond the goal. Another key insight is that the role of carbon credits and the use cases have changed over the past years, especially since 2023 in response to media coverage and integrity issues in the voluntary carbon market, along with greenwashing accusations. And since then, companies' approach towards using carbon credits to make offsetting claims has changed. So companies become more hesitant to make offsetting claims. And also we see that more and more companies actually set SBTi-approved climate targets. And this leads us to the challenges when aiming to develop a study design to investigate whether carbon credits have a causal effect on emission reductions. So based on the literature review and the interviews, we investigated the possibility to develop such a study design to assess whether there is a causal effect on internal emission reductions. And one of the challenges to do so is the dynamic market. So the role of carbon credits and the use case as they have changed makes it very difficult to reflect that in statistical analysis. Because it's not necessarily like a law of nature, but the role of carbon credits in companies' internal emission reductions can be very individual depending on the company's climate strategy, which has maybe changed over time. Then other challenges are unobserved effects due to confounding factors. So one example would be that if a company sets a climate target and that climate target can be achieved either through carbon credits or internal emission reduction measures. Then this could influence both carbon credits and also internal emission reductions. And then it would be very difficult to differentiate the influence of climate targets on both carbon credits and emission reductions, and to see if there is actually an effect running from carbon credits to emission reductions. Also, it could actually be the other way around, so that emission reductions can also influence the number of carbon credits being bought. So there's a lot of unobserved effects that could be ongoing, which would make it very difficult to derive a definite conclusion of whether there's an effect running from carbon credits on emission reductions. And then lastly, there are also some limitations in the available data. So the CDP database that is typically being used has very comprehensive data on carbon credit use, covers a lot of companies. But there are some limitations when using these data because, first of all, they're self-reported, and because of that, there could be a sample bias of, there being specific companies that report to the CDP. And there can also be measurement errors in self-reported data or difficulties in comparing entries, both across companies and over time. So overall, we derived the conclusion that it would be very difficult to develop a study design that could capture this entire complexity and assess the effect of carbon credits on internal emission reductions in a manner that is robust and also representative. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for the great presentation. Obviously, there's a lot there to unpack, and of course, in the actual study, there's a lot more detail than Sophia was able to go into. But yeah, I'm struck by, of course, the complexity in being able to design sort of a perfect study to test all these factors and to account for all the challenges in measuring everything fully. So, thank you, Sophia. Moving now to my colleague Benja, who wrote Carbon Market Watch's accompanying policy briefing, who will take us through Carbon Market Watch's views on the implications of these findings, as well as our broader recommendations for companies, market actors, and corporate climate standards, kind of a bit more broad. So thanks very much, and over to you, Benja. You're currently muted, but we can see you.
Perfect. Sorry, I was looking for this button. You can hear me now and see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. So, hello everyone. I'm going to present the policy briefing that Carbon Market Watch has published based on the Eco Institute study that Sophia just presented, which also connects to or mentions Niklas's study. So thanks so much for your presentations as well. At first, I wanted to give a little bit of background on why specifically we were interested in this particular question. So in the voluntary carbon market, there are many voices. And as an institution, we know that the VCM is unregulated as it doesn't have a central marketplace or a defined market price, or we all know also that no carbon credit is the same, and there's no centralized governance body, and there are different use cases for carbon credits. And especially, Sophia also explained, the use case of carbon credits is undergoing a constant shift and debate, where it was assumed that offsetting was the only use for carbon credits, and that has increasingly been challenged by the contribution model. So generally speaking, the voluntary carbon market is a place where ideas and narratives really shape the direction of travel. And as Niklas also introduced earlier, in the wake of criticism on the voluntary carbon market as an institution, there was a set of grey literature that has assessed this relationship between carbon credit use and the internal decarbonisation of companies. And so radiating from this body of literature came a framing that carbon credits in and of itself are ambition drivers, despite the fact that it's true most of the industry reports did look and expressively looked at correlations and not at causations. But there have been strong real-life applications of this narrative with many instances in which the argument has been brought to life. And on the right side here, I've copied a couple of instances in which the reports were used to make the case that carbon credits in and of themselves are signposts for superior action. And to name but one, it has also been used in Apple's recent greenwashing court case as a defense with the appeal to drop charges. And also in the SBTi's call for evidence on how carbon credits should be treated in the corporate net zero standard. So we were interested in understanding really what is this narrative based on and is it justified? What are the implications that come from it? And also what would you actually need to answer this question when setting up a thorough study design? And what challenges there are, you can read in Nicholas's paper and also in Sophia's report. And I do recommend reading both pieces because they're really nice giving a nice insight in how complex really the question is. And you've heard from them, but what I want to highlight here is that the fact that there is a narrative that needs to shift towards the many other topics that need attention too. In our briefing, we summarized some of the complexities and we also set out recommendations for companies, carbon market actors, and standard setters and regulators. And for companies, we've heard before, the use case of carbon credits really matter. And offsetting as a practice, so emissions compensation with accompanying carbon neutrality claims that suggest that there is zero impact coming from the company's actions, is commonly misunderstood by consumers and could potentially create a reputational cover rather than being a sign of action. So carbon credits do have a role and can feature in climate strategies, but they should never be a substitute for internal decarbonization. So companies must stop offsetting their emissions and drive direct and indirect, internal and direct emission reductions. And secondly, the narrative of the VCM can shift, and carbon market actors and advocates do have a voice and should use that voice to address quality and design concerns in the VCM and make sure that carbon credits have a complementary role in climate strategies as a means of beyond value chain mitigation. So this unfounded narrative needs to stop being pushed and be used meaningfully. And lastly, standard setters and regulators should stand their grounds and really develop robust frameworks for accounting, reporting, and disclosure of corporate pathways and process. And so looking a little bit beyond the complexity of it all, regardless whether or not carbon credits defer or accelerate climate action, there are shortcomings, critical shortcomings that have yet to be addressed and that remain unmentioned in the majority of literature out there. I mean, there is a lot of literature out there, and I guess that's where I'm going at. So while we have this big debate about what is the role of carbon credits really and does it boost internal decarbonization, which is a correlation debate, we should turn our attention to the shortcomings of individual projects and the way in which fraudulent behavior or project failure is managed. Specific project types that have rules that overestimate the impacts or inherent risk profiles that are too high to be unmentioned. And also market design that still accommodates black box secondary trade of carbon credits and incentivizes the production of more credits at the expense of project quality. And that already brings me to the conclusion that, and I have to give credit to AI here for this for this picture before I forget it. But the search for causality is full of challenges, and if we commit a lot of time and effort to this, it might be a distraction from the urgent questions of how to drive sectoral transitions consistent with the Paris Agreement's objectives. So instead of asking if carbon credits boost emission, we could also be asking how do we phase out fossil fuels? How do we restructure our businesses? And also how do we and in what construct do we finance real emission cuts within supply chains. And just maybe one illustrative example could be any multinational agri-food organization that buys carbon credits for forestry projects, but still sources cocoa from deforested land. So instead of investing in forestry carbon credits, they could also make sure that their emissions accounting works well and they stop sourcing from high deforestation zones in the first place. So that way the forest is protected and we all agree that forestry is important and that funding is currently lacking, but having a source solution is I think the way forward. And that way, the forest protection is done more sustainably or durably than through VCM projects. So I would end by saying that carbon credits can play a role when source problems are responsibly addressed, and always in the form of contributions and never in the form of compensation. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to say that this this picture that I inserted here is maybe also another example where a man bargains for the price of popcorn while the movie has already started, as a kind of comparison. Yeah, I think that was it from my side as well. Just a short wrap up and contextualization and future looking recommendations from our side. You can find the policy briefing and the Eco Institute report and also links to Niklas's study on our website. So thank you very much for the attention.
Thanks very much, Benja, for the great presentation. Yeah, so I think now we've actually gone through the presentations faster than I had planned. So very good timekeeping from our speakers. And yeah, I think so for the remaining time we can address it to any questions that have been asked in the Q&A. And this is also a reminder for those in the audience that if there are questions you haven't asked yet that you would like to ask, please do put those in the Q&A. There was one question that was asked about kind of if there's any correlation or causation between global carbon projects and global decarbonization, basically making the point that, you know, are emissions still being reduced due to the presence of those projects? And I think I have a question kind of building on that is, you know, we focused today on, you know, whether carbon credit use impacts corporate decarbonization, but then I think as Benny was speaking to, there's also more broadly a question on the quality of credits more generally, where we've seen a lot of issues on quality in many project types. So I wonder also maybe if this is a question for anyone, if any of you think, you know, what you think about the quality of credits and where that comes into the debate here. So kind of dissociating a bit from if it accelerates decarbonization, where does the quality of credits kind of feature in this debate as well? So I see Benja nodding her head. If you can go first if you'd like, but otherwise the others, please feel free to jump in if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think that's a nice question. I remember in the study setup, we were also touching on the quality of credits and thinking of like what would happen if you would also then make a distinction. You know how a lot of studies are comparing users with non-users and how to find a perfect sample, how that is really hard to compare different company profiles. I think the same is true for the use case of carbon credits. So are you using carbon credits for offsetting or for contribution claims? But also what kind of role does the quality of credits play? Really, are we looking at you know, the credits with reasonable integrity where we can trust that 1 ton is 1 ton, or are we talking carbon credits that might have human rights implications, negative human rights implications, or maybe if you only stick to the quantitative CO2 equivalent aspect, kind of what sort of implication would that have on the findings of the relationship between internal decarbonization and carbon credits? And we were saying that looking at the quality basically like explodes the frame, and it remains, at least for me, it still remains a valid question, but that is, I think, a different debate.
Yeah, I think also for me to answer this holistically, one would really need to look at the whole system from carbon credit production to sales to what is then done with the carbon credit and like the advertisement of companies. I think the production, there have been quite consistently studies that show that generally carbon credits overestimate their emission reductions across the sample, which does not mean that every single carbon credit is not valid, but on average, they have way less emission reductions than they claim. So as a carbon market, then the companies, what this carbon price, what they pay for their emissions, does with their emissions, that is the debate of, for example, today's webinar. So I think here we mostly find that there's no impact whatsoever. And then the question is, do customer consume more of goods that are, if they are advertised as green or climate friendly? If yes, that might increase would increase consumption and might increase emissions. Not they're not. So to say if the whole space's benefit is net positive, net negative, or neutral, I think so far there has been no research on that, also because it's very complex to put all of these together, all these three settings together into one framework that then says either it's good or it's bad. So I think it's a rather nuanced story.
Yeah, maybe I can only contribute a little bit because a lot has been said already. Of course, there's the one question of, how do carbon credits impact emission reductions? And that is already very complex to look at on a company level. And it's probably way more complex if you look at it on a global level. And then, it also plays a role, if they can be used towards NDC and so on. So in our study, we limited the scope only to the question of how is it being used, how would it affect internal emission reductions or not. And the second layer that is of course relevant to look at the global climate impact is the quality of carbon credits. And yeah, there have been studies showing that for many projects, the impact is overestimated. Of course, there are individual projects that can be of higher or lower quality. But there are a lot of factors that need to be considered, like additionality, permanence, robust quantification, and so on. If you're interested in that, I can also share a link to the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, where we analyzed several project types and how they compare in terms of quality. But yeah, I think holistically, it's difficult to answer the question because, again, it's even more complex than the question on a company level.
Yeah, also, especially I think if carbon markets or carbon credits, especially given their low quality and average, would be used to let companies off the like compliance schemes, I think then my hunch would be that the impact is rather negative than positive. But again, there's no scientific study, to my knowledge, that evaluates that.
Yeah, thanks very much for already great insights from all of you on that rather broad question. I think also one other question that kind of builds on that, I'll ask two questions, which I think also anyone can take as well. But I think the first one is kind of building on that question on compliance. There's a lot of corporate climate standards that are being revised or developed at the moment. And so I wonder if you have specific thoughts on, whether or how carbon credits should feature in kind of corporate climate target setting and achievement. So I think, there's some who have pushed for credits to count towards interim emission reduction targets, while others kind of are saying that it should only be on a contribution basis, so not being actually counted towards, target achievement for, value chain reductions. That's kind of one broad question on corporate climate standards and the ongoing work there, and if you think credits should play a role there, or to what extent. And then a second question, there's a question asking about if anyone has any insights on the role of investors in the financial sector in this, because this person has heard that companies are often pushed to adopt net zero targets that include offsetting by kind of investors and financial sector actors. And so if anyone knows, has any insight on that particular question. So those are kind of two general questions, and happy if anyone wants to start.
Maybe I can share some reflections on the second question. We conducted interviews with companies, and what we heard there is that investors are also more and more interested in SBTI-approved climate targets. And the SBTI requires to achieve the climate targets only through internal measures. So the climate target cannot be achieved through carbon credits. Only once the long-term target has been achieved, carbon credits can be used to offset the residual emissions. So that does not fully answer the question, but that is just like an insight that provides a somewhat different perspective, but it cannot be generalized, of course.
Great. Sophia, Benja or Nicholas, do you have any thoughts on either of those two questions? Otherwise, we can go to another.
Yeah. I definitely have something to say about the role of standards in this debate. I think in order to give a little bit of ideal world versus what's at stake now and why, I think it's very, very important that no targets can be achieved with carbon credits, and that's, I think, something that's also been underlined in Niklas's study with the target effect, where you have competing internal decarbonization measures with carbon credits that commonly go on a lower price than emissions reductions in-house are facilitated. So I think that's one part of it, that you just prioritize your investment into the right direction that then also stays, like once you have done an internal measure that normally, ideally speaking, that measure also stays that way. With carbon credits, there's a much higher risk of, depending on the project type, obviously, but also on the finance stream and decision making within the organization that this stops. And I think also in the wake of legal action that has been rising in the last years, I think that it's really important that the communication that companies are engaging in and doing has gained a lot of attention, where SBTI and other frameworks are saying you can't offset your way to your net zero claim, and you can't claim certain things based on carbon credits. And there's been a lot of court rulings in this regard. So I think that in the establishment of framework corporate accountability, it becomes more and more important that the claims side of things and the legal risks that companies are taking is also considered. So, and for that reason, accounting needs to be straightforward and easily digestible, not only by auditors and by financial institutions, but also by the consumer. So there's a lot of different perspectives on that, and I think that really does influence the direction of travel.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. And also, I think for many companies, especially in more emission-intensive sector, they really have to change a lot of processes, a lot of their value chain in order to even get close to net zero. So if there's the option to just whatever it takes to bridge the gap from their achievement of their target to the target with carbon credits, there's little incentive to go this extra mile and to really go target these difficult problems. And also, like we saw in this case of Delta Airlines, one could maybe say, okay, if they spend all this money that they spend on carbon credits on internal decarbonization, that might have actually not resulted in more emission reductions, because, I don't know, aviation is very hard to decarbonize. However, if these companies don't spend this money on internal decarbonization, the money is likely not going to come from anywhere, right? So if all companies always buy themselves out of actually changing much in their value chain and their operation with carbon credits, especially given the low performance of carbon credits and carbon markets. I don't think we will get very close to net zero anytime soon.
And thanks very much for all the thoughts on those questions as well. I think there's two other questions that are a bit also kind of broader, which for all of you or for whoever wants to jump in. There's one question about isn't there a risk that private sector stops financing high quality projects, leading to preservation actions not being conducted? And a second one, which is along the same lines, kind of saying that, you know, for forest credits, for example, if those aren't purchased by companies, does this not hinder conservation efforts if it generates finance for them? And so, I mean, I think, I think obviously there's a role a bit for beyond value chain mitigation that can be discussed, but I think maybe I don't know, Benja, I think that might have been addressed to you, but of course the others can also feel free to jump in on this as well.
Yeah, and I think this is a super valid question because especially with forests, that is such an interesting and important topic, and it can't fall off the edge of everybody's attention. I think it's really important to keep on questioning on how forest finance is done correctly or like rigidly, because it's in nobody's interest that forests are diminishing on the scale that they're doing it right now. But the VCM in and of itself, and especially with the use case of carbon credits right now, is not serving that purpose either way. So if you look at the amount of claims that are being based on REDD+ projects and and other nature-based solutions projects that have no durability and not the right protection mechanisms in place right now to also guarantee a permanent removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, and carbon neutrality claims on the other side, there is no, first of all, no how do you say? There's no scientific I don't know, the science for nature-based solutions and carbon neutrality claims doesn't add up because you're basically saying you don't have an impact and you remove CO2 from the atmosphere, whereas trees can't store CO2 long enough in their sinks to substantiate that claim. So I think that's first of all a use case problem with nature-based solutions in forests. I do think that there are lots and lots of other ways in which forest finance can be facilitated. And one is, that's what I tried to explain with this example. If you have a supply chain that goes into a forested area, then you can do a lot of things actually to make sure that the resources that you're exploiting from that region does not cause any deforestation. And further, I think you can also, by engaging with your suppliers and even with the industry, go into a dialogue and facilitate a lot of things. I think that the VCM does have a potential here as well, but if you have the two, the one versus the other, I think the source action really is where not enough attention is right now, and that's kind of the point that I tried to make earlier.
And I think, at least in my opinion, the voluntary nature of these carbon credits is also precisely one of the reasons why demand for these credits goes up and down. Then there's more finance going into when there's kind of a hype or a positive sentiment, and it goes down to less demand when there's a negative sentiment. I think these extreme fluctuation we've seen throughout the carbon market history, basically, and it also makes it very hard to make a bankable forestry project, right? Because you develop a project and then retrospective, you sell the credits and you don't know how much you get. Larger companies that can buy a lot of credits when they're cheap and then sell them later to big corporations that want to use them for offsetting can buy them cheap, sell them expensive without this money actually going to the forest. So I think this whole system needs some rework, that projects can be bankable from the beginning. There's a certain finance that is guaranteed from the beginning. And I think you could even, if you link that to compliance markets, use money from compliance costs of carbon that you then put into these these projects. So I'm not at all arguing that the projects that are financed through these credits should not be financed anymore. I'm just arguing that these credits or these market setups might not actually the best way to maximize the financial flows to these kind of projects.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks for.
sorry.
Sorry.
If I could add to that, I think that there's an interesting study that we did at Carbon Market Watch in 2 years ago, about the transactions that are impossible to follow in the voluntary carbon market currently, where project developers are getting a very, very tiny percentage of what is being lost basically in the trade chain of the voluntary carbon market as to compare to what a buyer puts into one credit. So I think it's also really important to, when making this argument that forest carbon credits are climate finance in that regard, is not necessarily true if we don't know where all that money ends up. That's one thing, and I think another thing as well is that once companies get their land use in order, it does make sense to invest in beyond value chain mitigation to address your ongoing emissions and to, as far as I'm concerned, also use the voluntary carbon market for that. But the current market design that we have puts a lot of pressure on projects and on the creation of as many credits as possible, because the fee structures in the VCM also incentivize more production, higher output in the issuances, at the expense of maybe details that have other ecological benefits and climate benefits and social benefits. So I think that there currently is a lot of pressure on projects by the way in which trade is happening that we need to break out of first. And then I think with a rethink, as Nicholas says, we can make use of that system again. But I think first and foremost, this narrative needs to shift back to what's at the source and how a supplier and supply chain action can actually be more effective than that.
Yeah, great. And yeah, I think indeed that there is a bit of a narrative sometimes that the VCM is the best way for channeling funds to the ground, and I may be missing it, but I think there's probably room for another study to analyze, how flows from the VCM versus other types of instruments, kind of what delivers the most impact or might be the most equitable. I think that's time for another study and for for a discussion another time. Yeah, I think we've addressed. I mean, I think there's still many questions that we could not address yet, but we're also just about coming to the end of the session now. So I guess, maybe this is the opportunity that if there is, I don't know if each of you has a kind of a concluding remark or thought that you'd like to share. I guess now could be the time for that, and then we could probably, I think, have to call it after that. So. Yeah, so maybe first of all, just thank everyone for attending the webinar and give you a little bit of time to think about if you have a concluding remark. But I think it's been personally very, very interesting for me to kind of better dive into all the nuance and better understanding how credits are used by companies and, whether there is any causation where we don't see evidence of causation between higher credit use and greater corporate ambition, which to me is an important takeaway given all the kind of narrative that's been going in a different direction for a long time. So but with that, so I don't know if anyone wants to go first, but happy to have a concluding remark from each of you, and then we can close. So who wants to go first?
Sure. So my concluding remark would be to slowly forget about this narrative that carbon credits are a great determinant also for environmental progress beyond carbon crediting itself, because generally companies spend very, very little money on carbon credit, offset very little of their emissions, and also can constantly change how they actually offset emissions. So there's also no stability of financial flows to these carbon projects.
Well, I think my concluding remark would be that, it really, the influence of carbon credits on emission reductions can be very individual depending on the company, because what really matters is what would the company have done if they did not use carbon credits? What would they have done more or less, or how would they have set up their climate strategy? So, and this can change, from company to company. It can change over time. There are a lot of factors that influence it, and yeah, so that is something to consider when designing climate strategies, I would say.
Perfect. And I think I would end with an atypical positive note here. I think historically speaking, the market has been very flexible, and that's also why it kind of emerged away from compliance systems. I think that with the vast amount of knowledge that we have in the VCM and all people involved in it, I think really if all the attention that is directed at all sorts of different topics, quality concerns that have to do with individual projects and design is attention is turned to that, I think we can really make a big change and make and turn things around. So I would end with that little call on everyone.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for attending the webinar. And yeah, it was a great discussion, and I very much appreciated. Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.